Hello everyone. Tonight we're going to walk through dark alleys where history whispers in low voices.
The outside might be a little chilly.
Or maybe you're listening to this video lying down, under blankets that hug your body like the walls of a medieval cell.
The candles in the city are extinguished one by one, and the silence that remains is profound.
So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you really like what I do here.
And if you want to share, tell me in the comments what city you're in and what time it is there right now. I like to imagine all the dim lights around the world, waiting for quiet stories like this. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan to create that soft hum in the background.
Or just close your eyes.
Tonight's journey begins.
The Last Fat of the Condemned. It sounds like the title of a dark story.
And perhaps it is.
Imagine yourself on a cloudy morning in the 14th century.
A city is slowly waking up. The market is still asleep, but the central square is already buzzing with hurried footsteps and uncomfortable murmurs.
In the center, a wooden scaffold creaks slightly in the wind, as if anticipating the weight it will soon carry.
The bells do not ring, but the invisible clock of justice has already begun its countdown. And among those who circle the scene, there is a man who is not there for justice.
Nor for the crowd. He is there for the fact.
The last fact.
There is no science as we know it today. There was belief, tradition,
and despair. It was believed that human fat, especially that from a recently deceased body, had rare healing properties.
It healed wounds that other balms could not.
It soothed chronic pain, and more than that, it carried with it something of the soul, a vital force that, if used well, could be transferred to the sick body. It was like an invisible transfusion of life, done through the skin. But there were silent rules.
The fat of the condemned had to be removed while still warm, still alive, still human. The executioners knew this. Some were paid in secret to cut a part of the body before the pyre was lit. A piece of the flank, the inside of the thighs.
Places where the fat was softer, denser.
It was a quick gesture, a precise cut, hidden by the shadow of the hood. And what was taken was often not buried with the rest. It was delivered in small jars, wrapped in damp cloths.
Sometimes it ended up in the hands of a healer.
Other times, in the hands of someone who loved someone who was sick too much.
And there were those who simply kept it, without knowing exactly why.
In ancient records, few speak of this openly. But there are accounts, fragments, scribbles in the margins of religious manuscripts. A monk, for example, describes the case of a boy with endless fevers. No medicine worked.
Until an ointment made from human fat was rubbed under the child's feet, while soft chants were sung. And that night, the fever broke.
Was it a coincidence?
Or an echo of what many believed?
That pain could be drawn from one body and absorbed by another.
The city slept again after each execution.
But there were houses where the candles still burned.
Where the smell of wax and heated fat hung in the air. The sound of a spoon scraping the bottom of a clay pot. The whisper of prayers mixed with the thick steam. It wasn't magic.
At least not openly. It was an invisible ritual, hidden from the church but preserved by the hands of necessity. And there was always a silence, right after it was prepared.
As if the one who performed it also wondered, is this right? And yet, time passed.
The ointments dried up. The jars were buried with the dead or burned at the stake.
But some recipes survived, stored in stained grimoires, hidden among ordinary-looking books.
And every now and then, a historian or curious person comes across an old, almost erased phrase,
talking about the fat of the condemned, as if it were a whisper from the past, asking not to be forgotten.
Perhaps, as you listen to this, you are wondering,
what else was done with human fat in the Middle Ages?
The answer, as we will see in the following stories, is as unexpected as the silence itself. But that
is for the next part.
He lived in the dampest hills of Alsace, where the fog never seemed to lift even at noon. They said he was an alchemist, although some called him a heretic.
His real name has been lost in the papers dissolved by time, but he signed his bottles with a single letter, Militars.
And it was at night that he worked. There were many candles, but they barely gave the room any light.
There were clay pots, old coins, books sewn together with hair thread.
And in the background, a thick, bubbling substance that smelled of and iron.
The cursed lard. He didn't call it that, of course. To him, it was an ointment of the soul.
Mixed with dried roots and ash from a certain type of bone, it was said to be able to heal internal bruises, soothe spasms in the body, and even prevent the appearance of tumors.
He wrote down every step, every result.
When the ointment worked, he made a blue mark on the parchment.
When it failed,
he used ash.
But what no one knew was that he only used human fat taken from the dead who had recently arrived at the local convent. And according to his notes, the younger the body, the more effective the ointment.
Some patients swore they had been cured by it.
A woman whose legs had not moved since giving birth
Walked 7 steps after being massaged with the mixture. A man who was coughing up blood.
but there were also those who became more ill, or had strange dreams, as if the ointment brought with it memories of someone who was no longer there.
The alchemist did not keep strict records of these cases.
He simply made a cross,
Small, discreet.
like someone who knows there is a prize, but chooses not to look at it directly.
Was it science? Or was it witchcraft?
In a time when these words were often confused, there may be no answer.
The inquisitors did not know about military yet, but if they had, they would have judged him quickly. Because it was not just the use of the fat that caused discomfort.
It was the ritual with which he did it,
The low prayers in distorted Latin.
the candles made of dark wax, and his eyes, which grew opaque whenever the fire reflected of the surface of the ointment.
The nights were long in that stone laboratory.
Sometimes he slept over the formulas.
Other times, he just watched the thick liquid swirl slowly in the flask, as if waiting for something to emerge from it.
A secret, a name, a whisper.
And they say that in his last days he stopped writing.
He started talking to himself, not sentences, but dates,
Dates of birth, dates of death, as if each flask had a story.
and he was finally beginning to hear them,
When they found their abandoned house, everything was there.
except for the jars. Only one was left, with the letter M engraved on the lid.
No one had the courage to open it.
It is kept, they say, in a forgotten wing of a museum in Bavaria. But some say that, even when closed, the glass fogs up at night,
As if something inside still breathes, still warms.
still remembers being human.
The alchemist's story is not isolated. There are similar records scattered throughout monasteries and in the diaries of ancient apothecaries. The use of human fat in rituals was often called superstition. But what defines a superstition if not the fear we have of that which works?
Without understanding why. And if Milites, as cursed lard was really capable of healing,
Was he wrong? Maybe.
maybe the real magic isn't in the ointment, but in the question he left hanging in the air. How far would we go?
To touch life with our hands.
The candles did not flicker in the wind,
There were no open windows in the room, no cracks through which the breeze could slip.
and yet the air seemed to move, warm, thick, smelling of something that was not waxed.
Accounts are vague, and witnesses few. But on certain nights, during certain rituals, it was not ordinary wax that illuminated hooded faces.
It was human fat, melted, molded, and burned silently, as if the flame itself knew the secret it held.
The oldest stories about these candles come from occult manuscripts, 15th century. Manuscripts that were not circulated in churches, but in homes with curtains always drawn.
In them, there were detailed instructions: how to melt, how to filter, how to shape the wick with strands of hair. Each candle bore someone's name,
And there was a purpose to invoke, to protect, to heal.
or simply to remember. It was believed that the light from these candles did not just illuminate, it guided, it led the soul back for a moment.
As if the fire were a mirror on the other side. Some of these practices were mistaken for witchcraft.
Others, for art.
And there were those who completely denied their existence, attributing everything to the delusions of the Inquisition. But the objects existed. Fragments of candles with an atypical composition were found in abandoned crypts, preserved by the cold. And there was a curious detail. They did not smell of wax.
But of burnt flesh, soft,
Almost imperceptible.
but undeniable. In some cities, it was said that certain houses had a candle that never went out, and that the family died young, generation after generation.
Coincidence? Maybe.
Or maybe it was the price of keeping a light made by someone burning.
Because, apparently, these candles were not just illumination, they were molded memory.
Longing in the form of a flame.
And like all longing,
Sometimes it burned longer than it should,
at the center of some legends, there is always a symbol.
and in this case, the candle was more than an object,
It was a rite of passage.
a rite of communication.
When someone died unjustly, their fat was used in the candle that would burn during the trial of the guilty party.
Not as punishment, but as a witness. The flame danced brighter when the liar spoke. It went out when the truth was told. It was the soul, they say, giving its last word.
Other accounts speak of candles used by healers to ward off spirits,
Placed in the four corners of the room, lit with whispered words.
one at each cardinal point, and in the center, a sick person with a fever, sleeping under human light. Was it healing? Was it comfort? Or just despair transformed into a ritual?
We don't know, but there is something in the image that will not fade.
Today, when we light a candle, it's easy to forget what it once was.
A silent flame, a weight, a whisper of darkness.
But one day, Somewhere in the world, a candle made of human flesh lit up a room.
And someone, looking into that flickering light, maybe they saw more than they bargained for. Maybe they saw someone. It was almost always dawn.
When the dogs were asleep and the bells had stopped marking time,
It was in this thick silence that they walked. There were 2 of them, sometimes 3.
with light steps and tools wrapped in cloth. They avoided crosses. They avoided prayers.
But they knew the paths between the tombs like someone walking through a familiar garden.
They weren't looking for gold or jewels.
They were looking for something else.
Something more.
Soft. They were looking for fat.
Human fat.
Fresh. Recent. Still moist. The perfect lard.
Official records
Pretended that this did not happen. But the diaries of midwives and apothecaries speak in almost transparent codes. White matter. Warm wax. Vital oil. That was all they needed. A handful. A small portion.
and to get it, they invaded newly closed tombs.
Preferably of young people. Preferably of those who had died without injuries. The body still intact. The body still useful.
It was a silent practice.
There was no shouting. There was no rush. Just the sound of the earth being moved aside, inch by inch. And then, the wood being opened carefully, as if it were a chest.
Inside, the light of an oil lantern revealed what they had come to collect.
It was not theft in the ordinary sense.
It was a ritual without a name, a nightly harvest.
And those who did it often did not know exactly why.
Some of these men were rejected surgeons. Others were simply desperate. There were even those who did it for love, to save someone.
To try, at least.
They took the fat in small jars, wrapped in linen cloths.
Sometimes, before leaving, they would leave something in return. A ring,
A lock of hair, a whispered promise.
as if apologizing was enough to break the desecration.
The fate of that fat varied.
It could be turned into an ointment to treat incurable wounds. It could be mixed with candle wax for discreet ritual, or it could simply be hidden in jars and manner heal as herbs. Some believed that, when applied to certain points of the body, human fat would provide protection, as if a part of someone else's soul had become a shield, a second skin. Invisible,
Subtle, ephemeral, the authorities knew, or pretended not to know.
in times of plague, war, and uncertainty. Sometimes the forbidden was tolerated if it served survival.
And there were those who said that the most looted cemeteries had, coincidentally, fewer sick widows, fewer feverish children, fewer cries at dawn. Was it a coincidence? Or were the grave robbers right in their silent work? Today, we walk among tombs with respect, but for centuries, there were those who saw their not as the end, but as a secret pharmacy, a place where death left not only pain, but also
Matter.
and on very quiet nights, there are those who say that the muffled sound of shovels digging can still be heard, as if time had not managed to completely erase the trail of those who sought healing.
In the silence of the dead.
Not all royalty slept in linen sheets and floral perfume.
There were queens who soaked in baths. Somewhat different. It was a treatment reserved for a select few, and even then it was done in secret, not out of shame.
But out of fear,
Fear that the origin of those ingredients would raise questions that were difficult to answer.
because among the substances mixed in the warm waters of those secret baths, there was honey, yes, but there was also human fat,
Melted, filtered, perfumed with herbs.
and carefully dissolved in the water. It was a more common practice than one might think, especially among noble families in northern Europe.
It was believed that these baths softened the skin, cured inflammation, and, in some cases, prolonged youth.
Some documents describe how fat was collected, usually from unidentified dead people, and delivered in clay pots. Honey was mixed in last, to disguise the smell, to gild death with sweetness.
The scenes described are almost surreal. A wooden tub, surrounded by thick curtain,
Steam rising slowly, like a veil,
the queen submerged up to her shoulders,
her eyes closed, her face serene,
and around her, maids stood in silence, some holding candles.
others fanning leaves to keep the insects away. No one spoke, because they knew what was in that water.
And they knew that it worked. The sessions lasted about an hour. After the bath, the body was wrapped in white cloth and left to rest.
It is said that the skin became firmer, that old pains were soothed, that more peaceful dreams came that night. And there were even those who believed that if the fat was from someone young, the energy of youth would be transferred, not like a spell, but like an echo.
A trace of vitality that still remained.
There were rules, of course.
The fat had to be fresh. The honey had to be harvested in the same season as the death, and the bath had to be done under the waning moon.
It is not known for sure whether these conditions had any real effect.
But for those who believed, every detail was essential, and each session was an almost sacred moment.
A pact between the body and the invisible, between the present.
And what is gone? Over time, the practice fell into disuse. not for lack of faith, but because medicine began to follow other paths.
More logical, cleaner. But there are those who say that some bottles of these ingredients still rest in old drawers of forgotten palaces, kept as relics,
Or as a reminder of a time when beauty, relief, and youth
came from silent sources.
and perhaps on some long ago night, as the steam enveloped the body of a sleeping queen, a servant girl wondered, who was this person?
Now resting in warmth, around the skin of another.
And what mystery was there in all this, if not the human attempt to stop time?
With his hands, there was no clock in the healer's hand, but she knew the exact time when the silence of the village changed tone.
It was when the cicadas stopped,
When the dogs went to bed.
when the sky took on a shade of grey that didn't always come from the night.
It was at that time that she lit the stove, small, cast iron, with signs of use that time had not managed to erase.
And on top of it, a clay pot, inside it, the lard, boiling slowly, crackling like rain on a dry roof, the softest sound of dawn. The houses around her pretended not to notice.
But there were watchful eyes behind the windows. They knew she was no ordinary woman. Her hands healed, her words soothed.
And her recipes.
Well, they weren't always made with plants.
Some ingredients came from sources no one dared to name.
Human fat, for example.
It was rare,
But when it appeared, she knew what to do.
she melted it carefully. She added resins, roots, and a drop of dark wine. The smell invaded the night, and no one dared knock on her door.
She worked in silence. Her hair was tied up in a scarf. Her eyes were lowered.
As if she were listening to something that did not come from the visible world. It was said that she knew the name of each ingredient by touch,
That one wrong pinch was enough for the ointment to turn into poison.
and that her hand never trembled, not even when the fat made that sound, the sound of the first bubble bursting, as if the body was saying goodbye one last time. There was a silent respect for her, even among the most skeptical,
Because everyone, one day, ended up seeking her help. A baby with a fever that wouldn't go away. A wound that wouldn't heal. An elderly person with pain that wouldn't let him sleep.
and when the balm arrived, warm, wrapped in cloth, no one asked how it was made. They just accepted it. They applied it,
And they waited.
as if that mixture carried something more than a cure, as if it brought comfort.
Records from the time mentioned these healers with ambiguous words. Women of wisdom, some said.
Witches, others murmured.
But they continued, night after night, preparing their balms, because they knew that suffering does not wait for dawn.
And because they understood that, sometimes, what relieves pain,
Comes from the most unexpected place.
even if that place smells of heated meat and dried herbs. A few recipes have survived.
Written in crooked letters on yellowed paper. One or two mention human fat, almost as a whisper between the lines. They say it worked best when taken from someone who had died peacefully, or who had loved deeply, as if love, even after death, remained warm there.
In the translucent thickness of the ointment,
And maybe that's what she heard every time the pot crackled over the fire.
it wasn't just fat boiling. It was history. It was memory. It was someone. And as she spread that ointment over the skin of the one who was suffering, maybe the healer thought that the real miracle wasn't the cure, but the silence that came after it.
They say that every village has its legend.
And that, among the stories told around the fire, some survive not because they are true, but because they are almost possible. One of those stories whispered for generations was that of human butter. Yes, that's right.
A white, creamy ointment with a texture similar to regular butter.
Used by healers, witches, midwives, and perhaps even soldiers.
The main ingredient, human fat, blended with herbs, sea salt, and something else that no one dared to write down. It's easy to imagine the reaction of someone who hears this for the first time. A nervous laugh.
A suspicious look. But the truth is that archaeologists found ancient pots with residues that did not belong to any known animal.
Substances that, when analyzed, showed traces of human fat mixed with medicinal compounds. And this gave the legend a new tone
It stopped being just a rural myth.
and became an uncomfortable possibility.
In Scotland, records of witchcraft trials mention this type of butter being found in the homes of accused women. It was usually hidden inside clay pots, wrapped in cloth and buried under the kitchen floor.
When unearthed, it still gave off a thick, half-sweet, half-rotten odor.
It was not known for sure what it was used for. Some said it cured, others said it caused vivid dreams.
And there were those who believed that just a touch of the butter could bring back someone who had already died.
It is curious how the human body, even after death, was seen not as an end, but as a resource.
A sacred matter.
There was a silent wisdom in this. There was no waste, not out of cruelty, but out of belief.
Human butter was not food.
It was medicine, It was protection. On stormy nights, it was rubbed on doorways to ward off spirits.
On nights of childbirth, it was rubbed on the pregnant man's belly. And at wakes, a little was placed on the hands of the deceased, so that he would not feel cold on the other side. Not all reports point to conscious use. There were those who consumed the butter by mistake, confusing it with regular butter in times of scarcity. And there are those who say that this caused visions, fevers, and a strange sensation of carrying.
Another memory,
As if the body assimilated more than fat.
as if it absorbed pieces of another existence. Time has erased the details,
But it has not erased the echo of the story.
and even today, among those who research ancient medicinal traditions, the term resurfaces every now and then. Manteiga di Gente people's butter.
Between laughter and shivers, the expression provokes questions that no one answers out loud. And perhaps that is what keeps the legend alive.
The fact that
It could be real. What if the truth lies between the lines of legend? If among the forgotten jars in museums or the texts erased by humidity, there are still traces of this practice? We may never know, but every time an old recipe includes the word white fat, a part of the story.
silently resurfaces.
Not all bodily aches and pains were treated with mulled wine or crushed leaves.
Some required more,
Not more strength,
but more silence, more time.
and something rare.
There was a recipe in an ancient grimoire kept in a convent in Normandy that described an ointment whose effectiveness depended on a single, specific ingredient, virgin human fat. The text was careful, shrouded in symbolism, but the instructions were clear.
To heal certain wounds that would not heal, one needed that which had not yet been touched. The wound, they said, appeared on soldiers,
On women who had lost children,
on men who had returned from the plague.
it was not visible at first glance,
But it hurt.
and it did not subside with time. It was a pain that carried something beyond the physical, something deeper, as if the body had absorbed a trauma and refused to forget it. In these situations, the ointment was applied with specific rituals. Dim light.
Still wind, absolute silence.
The fat was melted slowly. It was mixed with walnut leaves, pine resin, and a trickle of dark oil. The smell was thick, like old wood burning,
And when it touched the skin of the wound, it made the body shiver.
not from pain,
But from memory,
as if the ointment brought something back, a forgotten name.
a last face, a piece of time frozen there under the skin. Those who applied the balm knew they were crossing boundaries,
Not just those of medicine, but those of morality.
because finding virgin fat meant knowing its origin.
It meant having access to the body before it was claimed by mourning. And this required silent agreements with midwives, monks, and surgeons. Not everyone accepted, but there were those who did,
Moved by faith,
or by desperation.
discreet reports say that, after the application, the wound stopped bleeding.
But more than that, the person slept deeply, sometimes for hours, sometimes for days, and when they woke up, something had changed,
A lighter look, a more complete silence.
as if the pain had gone away, without fanfare, as if it had been welcomed by another skin, another body, another destiny.
No one knows how many times this recipe was used.
Nor if it always worked.
But the idea that something so specific could cure the unspeakable echoes to this day in forgotten manuscripts, and in the eyes of scholars who, when leafing through those pages, hesitate for a moment, thinking about the fine line between science, sacrifice, and superstition.
Maybe we shouldn't know everything.
Maybe some cures belong to a layer of time where logic can't reach,
Where the touch of a rare fat, applied under the dim light of a candle, is the only gesture capable of saying, "Now,
you can rest.
There was a smell in the alleys that even time could not erase. It was not just the familiar scent of death.
It was something thicker, stickier, as if the air itself had been coated with an invisible layer of boiled flesh.
During the plague, the cities became a single diseased body, and like all bodies, they needed someone to cut them up, drain them, clean them. These men were called plague butchers.
But not all of them cut them up just to bury them.
Some saved them.
Among the narrow streets of Florence, one of these men became known for always carrying a leather belt with small jars.
He wore a beaked mask, like the doctor, but his clothes were more rustic,
His hands were always gloved,
and his eyes.
too attentive.
It was he who collected the abandoned bodies, but instead of just dragging them to the fire, he would pause, he would choose, and some nights he would return with 1 or 2 jars heavier than they should have been.
Rumors began to spread among his apprentices. They said he melted the fat of the dead in iron pots, that he mixed it with nettles and crushed coal.
That the result was a dark, thick substance stored in jars hidden under his bed.
No one knew exactly why. Some said he applied it to his mask,
Others said he ate it in small doses.
and there were even those who swore he used it to rub on his feet before going to sleep.
The strange thing is that he never got sick. While doctors failed, monks coughed and women cried, he kept going, cutting,
collecting,
melting.
applying.
Those who knew him closely said that he became strange in the early hours of the morning.
He talked to the pots,
He murmured names,
as if the fat stored memories,
or voices,
and there were nights when he slept sitting up, with the pots beside him, as if protecting a secret to Viscus to be shared. When he died, his room was sealed.
but years later, when renovating the hospital, they found a small underground chamber.
Inside it were dozens of jars. Some were dry, others still had traces of substance. Later analysis revealed traces of human fat, vegetable ash, and, curiously, fragments of betel, as if he had tried to perfume the unbearable.
To transform something grotesque into a cure. Today, the figure of the plague butcher is shrouded in mist. For some, a madman.
For others, a misunderstood genius.
But what he left behind cannot be ignored.
Because even in the midst of the plague, he found time to extract something,
To save, to use.
as if the fat of the dead carried a strength that resisted its own end,
And perhaps that was what he was looking for. Not just protection from disease,
but a link to what lay between life and death.
a substance that, though part of the body, did not die with it.
Something viscous, yes,
But
eternally present. In some villages, there was a ritual that could not be explained in words. It was done with gestures, with touches, with restrained breathing. When a wound refused to heal, and common ointments failed, a last resort was used. An ointment made from human fat, but applying it was not enough. Something more was needed.
a kiss, soft, brief, like the breath of someone who wants to erase the pain. It was not a romantic kiss. It was a gesture of transference,
Of a desire for healing.
as if the touch of the lips were saying to the wounded body, take a little of my life in exchange for your peace. This practice was passed down from woman to woman,
From mother to daughter, from healer to apprentice, and it was always done in silence. No one asked where the fat came from,
they just accepted it, and the kiss, applied after the ointment, sealed the skin.
as if sewing something invisible.
The scars, they say, took on a different color,
Paler, smoother,
as if the body itself respected that gesture. Some believe that this kiss contained part of the soul of the person giving it, that there was a deep bond there, stronger than any prayer.
and so it could not be done in any way. The environment had to be clean,
The candle had to be lit, the silence had to be absolute.
because in that moment, more than treating a wound, an alliance was created,
A silent pact between two bodies, where one offered warmth.
and the other relief.
There are records in ancient letters written by travelers who witnessed this practice. One of them, a monk from southern France, described how an elderly woman applied the fat to a wounded boy and then gently touched her lips to the inflamed skin. The boy fell asleep within minutes.
He woke up without pain,
The monk, skeptical, hesitated to call it a miracle.
but he recorded it as a gesture that seemed to carry more than flesh and bar. Not everyone accepted the practice. During the Inquisition, any gesture outside of official medicine was viewed with suspicion,
Some women were persecuted.
accused of using magic, of manipulating death. But among the common people, the healing kiss continued.
In secret,
On feverish nights, in silences pierced by tears,
and even when human fat became taboo, the gesture remained,
adapted.
but never forgotten.
Today, we no longer use this type of ointment, but there is still something in the gesture of kissing a child's forehead on their wound that carries the same instinct, to offer warmth in exchange for pain, to say without words, I am here.
You will heal.
Healing does not always come from the ingredients,
Sometimes it comes from touch,
from affection,
from intention, and perhaps the greasy scars, so strange to modern eyes, were just that,
marks of a time when healing was personal,
intimate.
almost sacred, a time when a simple kiss could be worth as much as a whole bottle of ointment. There were nights when no one dared to leave their homes, not for fear of thieves or wild beasts, but for something more subtle, more ancient, something that seemed to descend from the sky with the silence.
And it was on those nights, especially during eclipses or changes of season, that certain people covered their skin with a dark, thick ointment with an unbearable spell. It was called, by some, the perfume of death, and that was exactly what it was.
A mixture made to deceive the invisible.
To mask the human presence before forces that could not be named. The recipe varied from region to region, but it almost always contained human fat, preferably aged.
Mixed with rotten roots, sulfur, and dried animal blood.
The result was a substance that, when applied to the body, left a trail of odor that lingered for days. The neighbors would stay away. The dogs wouldn't bark. And the spirits said they were retreating, as if that smell was saying, it's already occupied here. There's enough death here. The hands that prepared this ointment knew what they were doing. They were not witches. They were not healers.
They were guardians of an ancient knowledge, transmitted through gestures and whisper.
They prepared the perfume with respect, with fear, never in the sun, always in half light, in jars covered with thick cloth.
And when applying it, it was common to whisper protective phrases, words that do not appear in any dictionary, but that seem to calm the night.
Some reports tell of people who survived entire epidemics after covering themselves with this ointment. Others tell of children who stopped having nightmares.
And there were those who used it just once, as a rite of passage, and then never spoke of it.
Because the smell stayed
On their clothes, in their memories,
on their bodies.
as if their skin itself remembered having used death as a shield.
It wasn't something done out of vanity.
It was done out of necessity.
In times when the invisible seemed to always be lurking, covering oneself with what kept one away was a way of surviving.
Even if it meant enduring the stench of a world that didn't want to be touched.
It was a pact,
A gesture that said, I respect what I don't understand.
and so I disguised myself as you. Over the centuries, ointments were forgotten, replaced by floral perfumes, colognes, scented soaps. But there is something in the ancestral memory that still recognizes certain smells. A subtle discomfort, a shiver,
A memory that is not ours, but that seems to come from some dark corner of the lineage.
as if, at some point in the past, someone very similar to us had also covered themselves with an unbearable smell to survive the night. And maybe, the next time a strange scent invades the air, you will feel, for an instant, that echo, that sigh of time,
That scent of death.
that was once protection. The square was full,
It was Judgment Day.
and the smell of freshly cut wood mixed with fear and sweat.
In the center, the bonfire was already prepared, with layers of dry wood arranged like a rough bed waiting for a body. But what few knew, and even fewer dared to comment on, was that this bonfire was not burning just for justice.
That there was an ulterior motive there, a secret collection, a hidden destination for part of what was left after the flames died down.
The condemned man was called a heretic.
Sometimes for having said a forbidden phrase, sometimes for having loved someone he couldn't, sometimes just for existing differently.
But his body, according to some occult tradition, was more valuable than the verdict. They said that the fat of a heretic burned at the stake was special.
It carried power,
It carried transgression.
and that's why.
It worked. After the execution, when the crowd had dispersed and the screams no longer echoed between the walls, some men returned to the place.
In silence, with thick cloths, clay pots, and ancient knowledge.
They scraped the ashes carefully. They looked for places where the fat had run off and solidified.
Sometimes it was mixed with the wood, the fabric of the clothes, the metal of the chains.
And from there, they extracted what they called the essence of the heretic.
The substance was thick, dark, and smelled of smoke and blood.
It was kept in vials surrounded by symbols. It was not used by just anyone, only by those who believed that rebellion left physical traces, that a body that had defied dogmas could, after death, continue to defy.
But now, in liquid form, it was used in liberation rituals, in cures for illnesses that seemed like punishment, in practices carried out by those who refused the silence imposed by the dominant faith,
But there were also those who used it with trepidation,
as if the heretic himself was still present in the fact.
as if each application were an invocation.
That is why the rituals required firm words,
Clear will.
and always a lit candle, not as a tribute, but as a reminder of where it all began. In the bonfire, in the fire, in the heat that not only destroys, but transforms. The church knew about rumors like this,
And it feared what it didn't understand more than what it could condemn.
so it began to burn the bodies completely.
Until there was no fat left. Until there was nothing left. But even then, there was always the odd vial that escaped, stuck in saddlebags, buried under forgotten altars, as if, somehow, the heretic's flame was still burning.
Inside a pot.
And perhaps this is the true double fire,
The visible one, which burns the body.
and the invisible one, which warms an idea,
A gesture, a secret, that even centuries later.
still burns softly in the memory of those who dared to keep the unspeakable. He arrived early in the square.
He didn't speak to anyone. His clothes were dark, his face covered, his steps measured. To the crowd, he was just the executioner.
The one who ended stories, who turned sentences into silence.
But there was something else behind that hood.
Something that most people preferred not to know, because when the execution was over and the onlookers had left, he remained,
Sometimes for minutes, sometimes for hours, watching.
waiting for the heat to subside.
And then he would begin his other work. In certain cities, the executioner was paid twice, once by the justice system, once by the pharmacies. It was the doctors themselves, the most daring healers who sought his services. They knew he had access to something rare, something that, under specific conditions, was considered a precious ingredient. Human fat, removed immediately after death, before the body had hardened, still warm, still alive enough to be useful. With a sharp knife, he would cut specific points, places where the fat was purest. He would store it in jars lined with dried herbs. He would seal it with dark wax. He wouldn't say a word. He would just hand it over, and then he would move on to the next execution. It was a cycle, a double job, that of taking life, and then providing it in small jars, with discreet labels and uncertain destination. The vials ended up in makeshift clinics, in convents with secret wards, in midwives' houses. They were used to treat deep wounds, ulcers, fevers, labor pains. The belief was that the fat of the newly dead contained a raw force, not exactly spiritual, but almost, an energy that still vibrated, that, when applied to the skin, made the body remember what it was like to be alive. Not everyone accepted. Some called it profanation, black magic. But the truth is that, in times of despair, many preferred not to know the origin of the medicine. They just preferred to use it. And when the pain stopped, when the fever went down, there was a strange silence in the air. A silence of someone who knew, deep down, that they were being cured by someone who had already passed away. Over time, executioners lost this second trade. Science changed. Medicine began to reject these methods. But a few notes survived. Carefully written recipes, exact measurements, detailed instruction, and in the bottom corner of some of them, a firmly drawn hand. Not the doctor's, but the executioner, because he was also part of the cure. Even if he was never applauded, even if his name was never remembered in the books, he was the bridge between two worlds, the one that ends, and the one that insists on continuing. It was a sound that almost no one heard, but those who heard it did not forget it. It came from inside a modest house, far from the village, where the smoke grew slowly, unhurriedly. Inside, the fire burned under a clay pot, and inside it, the lard. It boiled silently, with small bubbles that burst from time to time, as if breathing. The spoon, made of dark wood, slid along the bottom. It was necessary to scrape, to avoid burning, to avoid losing the point. It was a simple gesture, but loaded with memory. The woman who lived there had been doing this for decades. She didn't sell it. She didn't offer it. She just prepared it. For you, for those who came asking with their eyes, but without words. He knew it wasn't a common practice, that it came from another time, but I also knew it worked, that it healed, that it warmed. And as the spoon spun, her thoughts mingled with the fact. Memories of those who had used that balm, of those who had been relieved by it, of those who had left. In peace, the smell filled the air. It wasn't unpleasant, but it wasn't easy either. It had something ancient about it, of animal, of human, a smell that seemed to say, I've been here for a long time. And as the spoon scraped the bottom of the cauldron, that repetitive sound created a kind of rhythm, almost hypnotic, as if time stopped for a moment, just to listen, just to feel. She knew when it was ready. She didn't need to taste it, or measure it. The shine on the surface, the density in the movement, the sound of the last scrape on the bottom, everything said it all. It was done. That was when she turned off the heat. She took the clean cloth. She filtered it carefully, without spilling, without wasting. Every drop was precious. Every portion, a promise of relief, of peaceful sleep, of less heavy days. Sometimes, while the ointment cooled, she would sit and be silent, watching, thinking about the hands that would receive that ointment, about the wounded skin, about the restless hearts. It was more than a preparation. It was a gesture of care, of listening, of sharing, because there, in that clay container, there was not just fat. There was history. There was humanity. Some said that the sound of the spoon scraping the hot lard was a warning, that it announced a cure, that it signaled hope. Others just thought it was strange. But there were those who stopped for a moment and closed their eyes, imagining, feeling, letting themselves be lulled by that sound that wasn't music, but almost. And perhaps that is what remains of the practice today. Not the jars, not the recipes, but the soft echo of a spoon in the bottom of a pan, reminding us that even in the simplest gestures, there is power, there is memory, and there is something in us that, without knowing why, is still. It was a small cabin, hidden among trees that seemed to whisper on windy nights. The door creaked slowly, and inside, time moved slower. Everything there seemed to breathe at the same pace as the witch. A woman with dark eyes, steady hands, and a barely audible voice. She had no name that anyone knew, just a prison, a scent of burnt herbs and honey, and a secret
a recipe that made even the most restless souls sleep deeply. It wasn't a spell.
It wasn't a miracle. It was a careful mixture, a preparation made in silence, as if any word could break the spell.
The base was always the same.
A clear fat with a creamy consistency, and according to the rumors that passed from mouth to mouth, it was human.
Extracted with respect, she said.
From bodies that had departed in peace, from people who dreamed beautifully, because, according to the witch, only those who die in peace can teach the body to rest. To this base she added wild lavender, poppy extract, and sweetwood shavings. She heated it slowly. She stirred it in circles, with the same spoon as always.
And as the steam rose, she murmured nonsensical sounds.
Words that belonged to no known language, but that seemed to touch something hidden in the listener, something ancient,
something he remembered from sleeping without fear. When the mixture cooled, she stored it in jars wrapped in dark cloth. She only gave one at a time, only to those who needed it.
And she gave clear instructions.
Rub a little on your wrist.
Breathe deeply.
Lie down without light.
Let your breath carry you. And almost always it worked. Sleep came like a veil.
No restless dreams, no interruptions.
Just a slow dive into inner waters.
Some said that the ointment also caused visions, that, when sleeping, it was possible to meet loved ones who had already passed away. That dreams brought messages.
That the body woke up lighter, as if it had visited another place.
No one could explain it, but those who used it
did not forget,
and they returned.
They always returned.
Vials were scarce, and when she left, she took the complete formula with her. But a few notes were found in her cabin.
Written on thick paper, stained with grease and wax.
Fragments only, but enough to raise questions, to inspire experimentation, to keep alive the mystery of the recipe that made one sleep. And perhaps that is its greatest power.
Not just to induce sleep,
but to offer real rest. The kind of sleep that the modern world has almost forgotten.
The sleep that begins in the skin and ends in the heart.
In ancient monastery, between cold walls and murmured psalms, there was a belief that few dared to write about.
It was said that human fat was not just meat. It was more.
It was where the soul sometimes hid,
where sins took root, not in the mind, nor in the heart, but in that subtle layer between the muscle and the skin. And so, some orders prohibited its use, not out of science, but out of fear. Fear of touching, even unintentionally, the invisible weight of another. These monks did not burn the bodies whole.
They prepared them, they washed them carefully, but they never touched the fat. They left it intact, as if they were respecting a silent reliquary, because they believed that every sin committed left a trace there.
A greasy echo.
A memory of the era, recorded in silence.
This idea was not isolated.
In many cultures, body fat was seen as a reserve, but not just of heat or energy, of memory,
of intention,
of transgression. So when someone very pious died, it was common to try to preserve their fat, to use it as a blessing, as a cure. But if the deceased was known for their wicked, their fat was avoided, or even removed and buried separately.
In certain manuscripts, there are records of ceremonies performed simply to release the fat.
Rituals in which small portions were slowly burned, accompanied by prayers.
The smell was strong,
but no one covered their noses.
On the contrary, they breathed deeply.
As if by inhaling that heavy air, the monk took on part of the sin,
and thus helped the other to truly rest.
The concept was simple and profound.
If the soul leaves traces, where else could they be, if not in what is soft, in what accumulates, in what envelops?
Fat was seen as a mirror of what was experienced,
of excesses,
of desires, of guilt,
and so handling it was a delicate task.
It required faith, it required silence, it required humility. Today, we speak of fat only in medical terms. Substance,
composition,
function. But perhaps somewhere in time this intuition still remains.
That the body holds more than we imagine.
That there are layers in us that are not only physical,
but symbolic. And that the skin, by covering, also protects stories that we dare not remember.
And perhaps, when you think about it, you feel a little shiver.
Not of fear,
but of recognition. That perhaps, yes, a part of everything we have lived still lives there.
Silent, present, warm, in the fat of the soul. In the monk's cell, there were only the essentials.
A narrow bed, a dark wooden crucifix, 3 books,
a rosary made of irregular beads,
and a small drawer hidden under the tabletop, where he copied scriptures in precise calligraphy. No one touched it.
No one asked.
But some novices, when cleaning the floor, noticed a strange smell, something between old incense and sleeping meat, a barely perceptible scent, but one that didn't match the rest of the monastery. Inside the drawer, wrapped in thick cloth, lay a jar.
Small, made of opaque glass,
with a wax seal that had never been broken.
The monk did not speak of it.
But every night, before going to sleep, he would place it on a table. He would light a candle next to it,
And he would remain silent,
for minutes,
sometimes for hours.
as if he were waiting for an answer that never came, or as if the jar had already said everything he needed to hear. There were rumors
That the jar contained human fat, from a friend who had passed away, from someone who had saved his life, from an old love.
no one knew, and the monk didn't explain it either.
He just said it was a memory.
That the jar contained what books couldn't teach. That inside there was something more than substance.
There was a prison. Some younger brothers found it strange. One of them, one night, tried to open the jar while the monk was sleeping.
But before he could break the seal, he felt suddenly unwell, a feeling of dizziness.
An inexplicable heat in his hands. He retreated and never tried again. The jar was put back in the same place, and silence was respected from then on. The monk grew older,
His writings became slower, more spaced out.
but the ritual with the vial never ceased, not even in his final days.
When he could no longer write, he would just look.
And when he left a note. Brief, a single sentence,
Some memories should not be spoken aloud.
only kept, with love, today. No one knows where that bottle is. The monastery was renovated. The cell was transformed into a library. But some say that on rainy nights, a discreet smell can still be felt among the books, and that sometimes a candle goes out on its own,
As if the bottle was still there,
invisible.
waiting for someone to understand what it is like to carry your memory in a hidden glass. Because not all heresy is a sin, and not all faith is written in ink.
Sometimes it is kept in silence, in a forgotten bottle, at the bottom of a drawer. It was an isolated convent built among hills where the sound of the wind seemed louder than the sound of voices.
The windows were small,
The stones were cold, and the silence thick, not an empty silence, but one filled with intention, with prayers said only with the mind. It was there, far from the world, that monks and nuns cared for the sick. But their methods, whispered between stone walls, involved more than faith,
they involved practices that today would seem strange,
like the use of fat vapor.
or tea made from bones.
The recipes were passed on discreetly. Some came from ancient manuscripts.
Others were learned through centuries of observation. When someone came in with unnamed pains, they would put them in a small room. A mist would begin to rise,
It was heated fat, filtered with herbs and roots.
a thick, hot vapor that enveloped the body.
It was believed that this vapor penetrated the pores, warmed the soul, and pushed out that which was too heavy. There was no rush. The person lay down on wooden boards covered with damp cloths. The eyes closed.
And little by little, the body began to sweat.
But it wasn't just sweat. It was release. Meanwhile, in a room next door, another nun was preparing tea. Ground bones boiled for hours, mixed with rue leaves and dormant seeds. The taste was bitter, but when drunk, the body seemed to sink. A weight on the shoulders lifted.
A rare calm emerged. These rituals were not called cures,
They were called cleansings.
because they believed that suffering was not always physical, that there were old hurts, inherited fears, thoughts that lodged in the flesh, and that they could only be released from the inside.
And from the outside, the steam took care of the outside.
The tea of what lived hidden.
And between the two, silence. Always silence. Some records were preserved in diaries.
One monk writes of a boy who, after 3 sessions, stopped screaming at night. Another nun mentions a woman who smiled again after months of mourning. No one promised miracle, but everyone recognized the signs.
The clearer gaze, the longer breathing, the deep sleep that came without warning. Today, almost nothing remains of these practices. Science has forgotten them.
Books have gathered dust, but some formulas still survive, hidden in marginalized notes. And sometimes a strange smell hangs over the corridors of old convent, a mixture of heated fat and dried leaves, as if time still breathes there. And perhaps that is what the silence of the convent has always held, an ancient knowledge, a deep care,
And the belief that, even without words, there are gestures that heal.
with steam,
With tea, with silence. It was subtle at first.
a barely perceptible smell, something between a burning candle and sweet meat left over from the fire,
People felt it first in their nostril, then in their stomachs.
as if the entire air grew thicker, warmer, and then they knew,
The Inquisitor was coming, not by bells, not by knights,
but by the smell, because before justice came preparation,
and in that preparation, fat was burned, part of the ritual, part of the warning, a reminder that, in this village,
something was about to change,
the Inquisitors did not announce their visits. They showed up, they left marks.
and they brought with them a practice that was as symbolic as it was punitive. On the eve of the trials, they lit small bonfires around the square,
And in them,
They melted human fat, mixed with resins, cypress, and charcoal.
They said the smell was purifying, that it warded of evil spirits. But the truth is, it served a deeper purpose, to instill fear. Children hid, old people locked their doors, and even the most innocent began to review words spoken, gestures made, thoughts held. Because the smell was more than an odor. It was an omen. It was a shadow. And once it had permeated the clothes, the wood, the ceiling, it would not leave, as if it wanted to stay, as if it had a memory of its own. There are reports of women who woke up in the middle of the night just by smelling something. They knew it wasn't just any breeze, that the scent, coming from far away, meant question, interrogation, forced confessions, because the Inquisitor used smell as a tool. Where there was fat, there was a body. Where there was a body, there was history. And where there was history, there was something to investigate. The bonfires were not large, but they were necessary, and the remains of the melted fat were often collected, stored in iron jars, taken as evidence,
Or, according to some rumors, used in secret ointments,
to mark, to recognize, to remember,
as if each jar contained not just fat,
but the scent of a moment,
of a decision.
of pain. Today, these practices seem distant, but there are still cities where, when walking through old squares, you can smell a strange smell on certain days. No one comments, no one points it out,
But the elderly cross their arms,
they close their eyes for a second,
and they take a deep breath.
as if remembering something they did not experience.
But that lives them. And perhaps this is the true trail of the Inquisitor.
Not the words, not the names, but the smell, a persistent aroma that warns,
That announces.
that transforms the air into an alert, and that, even centuries later, is still recognized by those who hear with their noses.
The spoon was still, halfway into the pan.
The fat was no longer boiling, but it was still warm. The light from the fire reflected off the thick liquid, creating gentle ripples, almost like the surface of a lake.
It was in that moment, as small as the blink of an eye, that he saw it.
A reflection, not his face, but something that seemed older, deeper, as if, for a second, the liquid was looking back at him with a gaze that was not his, a gaze of someone who was no longer there. There was no sound, just the faint crack of the wood breaking under the fire, and that sheen at the bottom of the spoon.
A sheen that wasn't just fat.
It was memory. It was present.
It was a subtle reminder that this wasn't just substance.
It was someone,
With a name, with a history, with a body.
with an end.
He stepped back for a moment. His hands trembled,
His heart slowed, as if the world had held its breath.
because until that moment, it had been easy to forget.
It had been simple to treat as an ingredient,
As a cure,
as a ritual,
but there, in front of the reflection, everything became intimate,
real.
alive.
The spoon was still there, motionless, a silent witness to the moment when utility meets consciousness, and he knew.
I knew that the ointment I was about to apply carried more than power. It carried presence, and that when I touched someone's skin with that mixture, I was not just passing on a medicine.
I was passing on a fragment of another life.
The thought stayed with him. It didn't go away with the steam, nor with sleep. It stayed. It grew,
And it began to inhabit every gesture, every preparation. Every night he repeated the ritual,
not out of guilt, but out of reverence, because he finally understood that between what is body and what is spirit, there is a line made of fat, silence, and memory.
Today, no one uses that spoon anymore.
It rests on an old wooden shelf, next to a nearly empty jar. But anyone who enters that room feels something,
Not fear, nor regret.
but a kind of respect that only arises when one understands that every cure has a cost.
And that, sometimes, a medicine that relieves, also looks back at us. And maybe that's how these stories end.
Not with answers,
But with reflections, with brief images.
with silences that say more than any words. Because deep down in the spoon, in that last layer of shine, there is still the question that spans a century. How many lives have we touched?
Without realizing it,